Everybody, thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 11th, 2026, about 8:50 p.m. where I'm at right now, and we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 19 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, a textbook written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. We are jumping into Chapter 9, The Psychology of the Unconscious. Starting on page 254, we will be reading for an hour, then taking an hour-long break because I have an English class I need to teach at 10 p.m., and then we will be coming back to finish all of Chapter 9 with the remaining time that it takes. I don't know if that will take an hour or another hour and a half or two. I don't know. I suggest everybody go watch the previous live streams of all the episodes where we talked about the history of psychology. Without further ado, jumping into Chapter 9, The Psychology of the Unconscious, we will read for about an hour or so. Let's go. Introduction: The Rise, Influence, and Decline of Psychoanalysis. The psychology of the unconscious was markedly different from the psychology of consciousness. Wundt and the other psychologists of consciousness focused on the normal human adult mind known through introspection, attempting to make experimental science out of philosophers' traditional questions and theories. The areas of sensation/perception and cognitive psychology largely defined the field, although some attention was given to social, developmental, and animal psychology. Freud's psychology, in contrast, focused on abnormal minds and claimed to unmask consciousness, including normal consciousness, as a self-deceiving puppet of disgusting primal impulses. It dated, not acknowledge. Okay, sorry. I'm going to read that again because that's a confusing sentence. Freud's psychology, in contrast, focused on abnormal minds and claimed to unmask consciousness, including normal consciousness, as a self-deceiving puppet of disgusting primal impulses. It dated, not acknowledge. Instead of conducting experiments, Freud investigated the mind by clinically probing it, looking for the concealed springs of human conduct in consciousness, primitive residues of childhood and evolution that he claimed to find in his patients' symptoms, dreams, and therapeutic talk. Freud's character, too, was different from that of the other German founders of psychology. Wundt, his students, and the Gestalt psychologists were, for all their differences, products of Mandarin Germany, cautious and circumspect scholars and scientists. Freud, however, rejected the Mandarin outlook, scorning to distinguish culture and civilization. He was born a Jew, but was an atheist proud of his Jewish heritage, and lived in the shadow of Austrian and German anti-Semitism. Freud wanted to be a conquering hero in the mold of his hero Moses, bringer of disagreeable commandments to a disbelieving people. Possibly under the influence of cocaine, he used it regularly in the late 1880s and 1890s. Freud described himself to his fiancée, Martha Barnes, born February 2nd, 1886, as a daring man ready to die for a great cause. In 1899, as his interpretation of dreams was being published, Freud described himself to his intimate friend Wilhelm Fleiss as neither a scientist nor an experimenter, but as a conquistador. Both self-judgments were correct, and more than anything else explained the failure of psychoanalysis. To the world he aimed to conquer, Freud presented psychoanalysis as a revolution. Psychoanalysis, he often said, represented the third great blow to human self-esteem. The first blow was Copernicus's demonstration that human beings did not live at the center of the universe. The second blow was Darwin's demonstration that human beings were part of nature, being animals like any other. The third blow, Freud claimed, was his own demonstration that the human ego is not master in its own house. Freud is inescapable is how Peter Gay summarized the conquistador's achievement. There can be no doubt that we all speak Freud whether we know it or not. Freud's terminology and his essential ideas pervade contemporary ways of thinking about human feelings and conduct. Nevertheless, it is both ironic and inevitable that Freud's influence could have been less in academic psychology than in any other field concerned with human affairs, save economics. Here's a picture of Freud right here, born 1856 and died in 1933, the founder of psychoanalysis, in a photo taken in 1938, about the time he fled Vienna as it was being seized by the Nazis. Psychologist of consciousness rejected the existence of the unconscious, Freud's indispensable hypothesis. Behaviorists rejected the existence of mind altogether. So it is unsurprising that, apart from occasional recognition of Freud's somewhat literary insights into human motives, academic psychology largely ignored or rejected psychoanalysis. Rapprochements between academic psychology and psychoanalysis have sometimes been sought, but never achieved. Moreover, the isolation of psychoanalysis from academic psychology was abetted by the development over Freud's own objections of psychoanalysis as a branch of medicine. Especially in the United States, an MD degree with specialization in psychiatry became the prerequisite for undertaking training as a psychoanalyst. Isolation became enmity with the professional rivalry that arose between psychiatry and clinical psychology. Psychiatrists have always tended to look on clinical psychologists as poorly trained interpreters in the business of medicine, and in the case of psychoanalysis, this resulted in the exclusion of PhD psychologists from training in schools of psychoanalysis. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Freud shared the goal of the other founders of psychology, to create a psychology that was a science like any other. Freud rejected the suggestion that psychoanalysis offered anything other than a scientific view of the human world. Yet Freud did not undertake to construct an experimental psychology of the unconscious, nor did he welcome attempts to experimentally verify his ideas. In the 1930s, an American psychologist, Saul Rosenzweig, wrote to Freud about his attempts at experimental testing of psychoanalysis. Freud replied very briefly on February 28, 1934, "I have examined your experimental studies for the verification of psychoanalytic propositions with interest. I cannot put much value on such confirmation because the abundance of reliable observations on which these propositions rest makes them independent of experimental verification. Still, it can do no harm." The abundance of reliable observations on which Freud erected psychoanalysis consisted of his clinical cases. We are apt to think today of psychoanalysis as primarily a therapy, but Freud did not. Freud originally wanted to be an academic psychologist in the mold of Helmholtz. He turned to private medical practice in order to afford to marry, and he developed psychoanalysis in the context of performing psychotherapy. Nevertheless, he always meant psychoanalysis to be a science and regarded therapeutic success as his measure of scientific validity. For Freud, a therapy will be effective if and only if the scientific theory from which it derived was true. He therefore regarded the talk of his patients as scientific data and the analytic session as a scientifically valid method of scientific investigation. Indeed, his remarks to Rosenzweig suggest that he regarded analysis as more than the equal of experimentation as a scientific method. For Freud, successful therapy was not an end in itself, but constituted evidence that psychoanalytic theory was true. Freud's dismissal of experimental methodology served to further isolate psychoanalysis from mainstream psychology. Psychoanalysts said that only someone who had been through psychoanalysis was fit to criticize it, leading academic psychologists to regard psychoanalysis more as a cult with an initiation rite than as a science open to all. Furthermore, reliance on clinical evidence raised more than political difficulties for psychoanalysis as a science. Fechner, Donders, Wundt, and others had introduced experiment to psychology in order to rid it of unscientific subjectivity, replacing armchair introspection with experimental rigor. Psychoanalysis sought to replace armchair introspection with couch introspection, and it could be reasonably asked whether Freud had replaced a bad method with a worse one. After all, the introspective observer in psychoanalysis is a patient to be cured of neurosis, rather than a trained observer committed to the advancement of science. These were not and are not idle concerns, and as we shall see, they may have played a subterranean role in Freud's greatest challenge, his seduction error. Continuing. Freud and biology. Like the other founding psychologists, Freud was initially attracted to the idea of approaching psychology through physiology. In Chapter 8, we reviewed why, for Wundt and other founding psychologists, the path through physiology was attractive. Freud's situation and ambition as a founder were to a large extent. Let's repeat that again. Freud's situation and ambition as a founder were to a large extent the same as the other founders. He had a medical degree and carried out important work in anatomy and physiology. Ernst Bruck, one of Helmholtz's students who had sworn themselves to reductionism, had taught Freud and influenced him considerably. Thus, Freud's psychology was likely to be physiological for the same reasons as Wundt's. But once Freud took up clinical practice and began to create psychoanalysis as both science and therapy, the path through physiology also exerted two special attractions for him. First, one charge that could reasonably be leveled against a science built on the talk of neurotic patients was cultural parochialism. Science is supposed to discover universal truths, laws of nature that hold good across time and space. In the case of psychology, this means finding explanations of human behavior that transcend any particular culture or historical era. Living up to this standard of science was vexing enough for experimental psychologists, who could at least point to the rigor and simplicity of their experiments as warrant of their universal character. But such a claim could not plausibly be made for psychoanalytic therapy. However, if therapeutic findings were used to elaborate a neurophysiological theory of mind and behavior, then charges of cultural parochialism might be deflected. After all, human nervous systems exist apart from culture, so that a theory pitched at the neural level could stake a claim to universal truth. Second, for Freud, the most unique attraction to the path to science through physiology lay in his situation as a clinical neurologist. Today, the term neurosis is virtually synonymous with a disorder that is entirely mental, all in your head. But in Freud's time, neuroses were viewed as primarily disorders of the nervous system. By far the most common neurosis at the time was hysteria. In our post-Freudian world, hysteria is called dissociative disorder, defined as a physical symptom having a psychological cause. But in Freud's time, the physical symptom of hysteria, such things as paralyses and failures of sense perception, were thought to stem from an unknown disorder of the nervous system. We will discuss the nature of hysteria more fully later. Freud and reductionism, the project for a scientific psychology. In Freud's case, the physiological path to scientific psychology found fullest expression in a manuscript he never completed, The Project for a Scientific Psychology, published in 1950. It was written in a white heat of Newtonian passion in the fall of 1894 and the spring of 1895. Freud was tormented by two aims: to examine what shape the theory of mental functioning takes if one introduces quantitative considerations, a sort of economics of nerve forces, and second, to peel off from psychopathology a gain for normal psychology. In the project itself, Freud defined his Newtonian intention to furnish a psychology that shall be a natural science, that is, to represent psychical processes as quantitatively determinate states of specifiable material particles. He went on to develop a general theory of mind and behavior in entirely physiological and quantitative terms. For example, Freud described motivation as resulting from the buildup of tension at barriers, today called synapses, between neurons. This buildup is felt as unpleasure, and its eventual discharge across the barrier is felt as pleasure. Memory was explained, as it is in most neural models today, as changes to the permeability of neural barriers, changes in synaptic strength, resulting from repeated firing of connected neurons. In similarly quantitative neurological ways, Freud explained the full range of mental functions from hallucinations to cognition. Freud's project remains one of the most fascinating but troublesome documents in the history of psychoanalysis. It is fascinating because so much of Freud's psychological theory is introduced in the project in neurological guise, but it is troublesome because it is hard to evaluate Freud's final attitude toward it, or properly place it in the history of psychoanalytic thought. Because he abandoned writing it and later resisted its publication, it is fair to conclude that Freud regarded the project as fatally flawed, but the question remains, why? The standard account accepted by later Freudians is that shortly after working on the project, Freud undertook a heroic self-analysis in which he discovered that the causes of behavior are psychological events occurring in a psychological unconscious, and he consequently abandoned the project as a young man's foolishness, just as Wundt regarded his early commitment to reductionism a sin of his youthful days. On the other hand, Leahey has persuasively argued that regarding Freud's self-analysis as the critical event in the history of psychoanalysis is a myth. Leahey proposes that it was put out by Freud and his followers to obscure Freud's continued reliance on biology as the secret foundation of psychoanalytic theory. Freud gave up the project because he could not construct a mechanism compatible with his main guiding thesis about the origin of neurosis. Whether in the seduction theory or later, Freud always held that adult neurotic symptoms find their ultimate cause in a childhood trauma or a disgusting fantasy. At the time of its occurrence, this trauma or fantasy has no pathological effect, but it lies dormant and is unconsciously reawakened, expressed as a symptom years later. This view of the etiology of symptoms was so dear to Freud that he gave up neurologizing, but he did not give up biology. Once again, this view of the etiology of symptoms was so dear to Freud that he gave up neurologizing, but he did not give up biology. And now we're going to pause right here to find out what is etiology. I've never seen this word. Etiology definition. Let's see. The cause, set of causes, or manner of causation of a disease or condition. Okay, what causes a disease? Okay. All right, the investigation into the cause of something. Okay, let's put that here. Etiology. All right, continuing. All right, so according to Leahey, Freud turned from physiological biology to Lamarckian evolutionary biology to explain human development. For example, many scientists of the day, including Wundt, accepted the biogenetic law of Ernest Haeckel. Haeckel was born in 1834 and died in 1919. Haeckel was Germany's leading Darwinian. According to the biogenetic law, which we now know to be false, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That is, the embryological development of any creature repeats its species' evolutionary path. Thus, to causal inspection, a human fetus passes through an amphibian stage, a reptilian stage, a simple mammal stage, and so on, until it resembles a miniature human being. Freud simply extended the biogenetic law to include psychological development. He regarded the stages of psychosexual development as recapitulations of the sex life of our predecessor species. Interesting, very interesting. Haeckel's theory of recapitulation provided Freud an explanation of the delay between the events that caused hysteria and its manifestation in symptoms. At this point, in his career, Freud believed that hysteria was caused by sexual abuse of young children, but that the abuse caused no immediate pathology. Instead, the experience lay dormant in memory and unconsciously caused symptoms to appear in adulthood. Freud had not yet developed his theory of childhood sexuality, and he could claim that the sexual trauma had no immediate effect on the child because it was not developmentally appropriate. Because the victim was asexual, the experience meant nothing. It became meaningful when sexuality emerged in adulthood, and the repressed memory exerted a toxic effect, throwing the patient into hysteria. Central to Freud's new biological conception of human development and behavior was the sex instinct. Sex provided a basis for constructing a truly universal and naturalistic scientific psychology, because it was neither species nor culture specific. Following the path of the Enlightenment and going against the German mandarins, Freud wanted a psychology shorn of scientifically irrelevant cultural factors. The ubiquity of the sex drive provided its foundation. Freud always supposed that the list of biological needs was short: hunger, thirst, self-preservation, and sex, and later aggression. If one accepts this list as exhaustive, then one has a problem explaining much of human behavior. It is clear that animal behavior always seems to serve one of these needs, but it is equally clear that human behavior does not. Humans build cathedrals, paint pictures, write novels, think of philosophies, and conduct science, none of which immediately meets any biological need. Earlier writers on human motivation, from Plato to Franz Joseph Gall to the Scottish realist, were not faced with this problem because they supposed that human beings have special motives that lead to religion, art, philosophy, and science. Freud, however, by taking a biologically reductive and simplifying view of motivation, accepted a short list of drives and needed to show that behavior not directly caused by them was, in reality, indirectly caused by them. It had to be the case that instincts could be redirected from their innately determined channels into other, less biological ones. Hunger, thirst, and self-preservation are poor candidates for rechanneling because satisfying them is necessary for the survival of the organism. Sexuality, on the other hand, is a powerful motive whose satisfaction can be postponed or even abandoned. The animal may be unhappy, but it lives. Sexuality, then, is the biological motive most capable of displacement from sexual satisfaction into a more socially acceptable and creative activity, or into neurosis. Freud was not the first to find in sex the hidden cause of human achievement. Romantic poets and philosophers such as Schopenhauer talked about the sublimation of sexuality into higher things, as did Freud's friend Fleiss. Only Freud, however, made sublimation part of a general theory of human mind and behavior. Moreover, the sexual drive is the one human societies take the greatest interest in regulating. Societies universally regulate the sort of person one may take as a sex partner and marry, while taking little interest in one's dining companions. It appeared to Freud then that society actively seeks to rechannel sex away from its natural goal toward more civilized ones, but has in many cases his patients made neuroses instead. By playing the key role in the formation of neuroses, sex gave Freud's science a biological foundation. In the case of the actual neuroses, the sexual factor is the essential one in their causation, since the nerve poisons that cause actual neuroses are generated by wrong sexual practices, such as adult masturbation or sexual abstinence. The situation with regard to psychoneuroses was different, with sexuality playing a more psychological role. The most purely biological factor in psychoneuroses was the prior state of the nervous system, because hereditary influence is more marked than in the actual neuroses. Sexuality came into play as the factor working on the nervous system to cause the symptoms of hysteria. In Freud's early theorizing, sexual seduction of a child provided the trauma that would later blossom into neurosis. In his later theory, childhood sexual fantasies provided the kernels of adult neuroses. By 1905, Freud had written the founding works of psychoanalysis, Interpretation of Dreams, and 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and had sorted out what was biological and what was psychological in psychoanalysis. Some of my medical colleagues have looked upon my theory of hysteria as a purely psychological one, and have for that reason pronounced it ipso facto incapable of solving a pathological problem. But it is the therapeutic technique alone which is purely psychological. The theory does not by any means fail to point out that neuroses have an organic basis, though it is true that it does not look for that basis in any pathological anatomical changes. No one probably will be inclined to deny the sexual function, the character of an organic factor. And it is the sexual function that I look upon as the foundation of hysteria and of the psychoneuroses in general. Thus, Freud came to find in sex the main motive in human life. Sex furnished an organic basis for neurosis and a universal biological basis for his theoretical psychology. Another reason was his discovery of childhood sexuality as the root cause of neuroses. A third is found in social history. Men and women of Freud's day really did find sexuality hard to cope with. Freud and other physicians found themselves presented with problems rooted in the 19th century's struggles with sexuality. The cause of the problem was straightforward. As societies develop economically, they experience an important demographic transition from large families to small ones. In rural and village societies, children are economic resources, hands to be put to work as soon as possible, and the main support in their parents' old age. In industrially developed societies, children become economic liabilities, costly to raise and educate before they can join the workforce. They become drains on parents' income. As standards of living rise, children become increasingly less attractive economically, and parents begin to have fewer children. The middle classes of Victorian Europe acutely felt the problem of controlling reproduction without modern contraceptives. To succeed economically, they had to work hard and exert enormous self-control, including control of potentially costly reproduction. They looked on the large families of rural and laboring classes for whom children were still exploitable resources with a mixture of horror and salacious envy. The middle class abhorred the squalor and misery of lower class lives, but was envious of their sexual freedom. Poet George Meredith expressed both attitudes. You burly lovers on the village green, yours is a lower and happier star. Freud, too, saw greater sexual happiness among the poor without wishing to join them. Describing for a lecture audience 2 imagined case histories, he said sexual activity appeared to the caretaker's daughter just as natural and unproblematic in later life as it had in childhood, and is free from neurosis, while the landlord's daughter experienced the impact of education and acknowledged its claims, turned from sex with distaste, and became neurotic. Yet Freud, like most educated and agnostic or atheistic Victorians, continued to live on nerve, never prescribing sexual liberation. Sounding like a German Mandarin, he wrote to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, the rabble live without constraint. The rabble live without constraint, wrote Freud, while we deprive ourselves. We, bourgeoisie, do so to maintain our integrity. We keep ourselves for something, we know not what, and this habit of constantly suppressing our natural drives gives us the character of refinement. Freud, the clinician, identified sex as the root of his patients' problems because at that time and place, his patients had a hard time accommodating sex alongside their economic and moral aspirations. If Freud's emphasis on sexuality sometimes seems alien and implausible today, it may be because the sexual reforms he championed but did not gain from came about and because technology has improved contraception. Sex is still a problem in the era of HIV/AIDS, but not in the way it was for Freud's civilized sufferers. Interesting. Continuing here, Freud and psychiatry treating hysteria. The puzzle of hysteria. The most common neurotic disorder of Freud's time was hysteria. The diagnosis was ancient, harking back to Greek times. Hyster is the Greek word for womb, and it was long thought that only women could be hysterical. Although the signs and symptoms of hysteria varied greatly over the centuries, the diagnosis endured until the 20th century. Today, cases of hysteria and its nosological descendants, conversion reaction, scarcely exist. Asking why is important for understanding not only Freud's thinking, but also the impact of psychology on society. In the 19th century, medicine, including psychiatry and neurology, was just beginning to be placed on scientific foundations as diseases began to be linked to underlying pathologies. One of the early triumphs of scientific diagnosis, for example, was linking tuberculosis to a specific pathogenic cause, the tuberculobacillus. Many signs and symptoms of disease could not yet, however, be traced to any organic pathology. Hysteria became a sort of diagnostic dumping ground for such symptoms. For example, we will learn that in the case of Freud's patient, Dora, one of her hysterical symptoms was a persistent cough. Some alleged cases of hysteria were almost certainly cases of diseases not yet recognized by 19th century medicine. Two likely candidates are focal epilepsy and neurosyphilis. In focal epilepsy, only small portions of the brain are subject to seizure, resulting in transient pathologies of perception and motor control, precisely the sort of symptoms associated with hysteria. A person infected with syphilis shows a few immediate symptoms in the genitals, but left untreated, the spirochete lies dormant in the body and can attack the brain and nervous system many years later, causing serious psychological disorders. Because of the great time lag between infection and the appearance of psychological symptoms, connecting the two, diagnosing neurosyphilis, was difficult, and it is possible that many such patients were called hysterical. Going to the comments here, Kamal says, they claim sex was the problem. Ain't that the truth? Yes, back then, Freud was obsessed with sex. He thought it was where all problems stem from. Anyway, syphilis is scary as hell. That's one disease I'd never want or never wanted to get. Whatever the underlying reality of the disease hysteria may have been, 19th century physicians were coming to look upon hysteria as a physical disease of unknown origin. Before the advent of scientific medicine, hysteria had been viewed as a moral failing, whether a weakness of will or a possession by evil spirits. William James, who suffered from nervous diseases himself, spoke for enlightened medical opinion and long-suffering patience when he said in his 1896 Lowell Lectures on Abnormal Mental States, poor hysterics, first treated as victims of sexual trouble, then of moral perversity and mendacity, then of imagination, honest disease not thought of. Ironically, in the same year, 1896, Freud gave a paper on hysteria before the Society of Psychiatry and Neurobiology, in which he broached for the first time his view that hysteria had a pathological, specifically sexual etiology. Chairing the session was the greatest student of sexual psychopathology of the day, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who pronounced Freud's theory a scientific fairy tale. James Krafft-Ebing and the rest of the medical establishment, Freud called them donkeys, regarded the strictly medical view of hysteria as a great advance. Unfortunately for patients, physical etiology for hysteria prescribed physical treatments, no matter how mysterious the malady. Treatments for hysteria were often heroic in the extreme. The leading treatment was electrotherapy. Its milder form was ferretization, for which Freud bought the needed equipment in 1886. The patient, naked or lightly covered, was seated in water with her feet on a negative electrode, while the physician probed her body from head to foot with a positive electrode or, for sensitive patients, with his electrical hand, the current passing through his own body. Treatment sessions lasted 10 to 20 minutes and were frequently repeated. Many patients had severe adverse reactions, ranging from burns to dizziness or involuntary defecation. Boy, it was torture back then, my God. Psychology was literally torture. Oh my God. Such treatments may fairly be regarded as abuse of women by powerful men, but it should also be noted that treatment for some male disorders was frequently heroic, involving, for example, cauterization of parts of the genitalia. It should also be remembered that medicine was just beginning to be based on scientific research. Physicians had discarded ancient theories of disease, but were just beginning to develop better ones, such as the germ theory. Yet they still had to treat suffering patients and therefore tried any treatment that might work. A parallel may be drawn between psychiatric treatment in the 19th century and cancer treatment in the 21st century. Cancer is a horrible disease that is only now yielding up its secrets, and physicians have had to make their patients undergo painful regimes of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and surgery, even when such treatments offer only modest hopes of a cure. Some of the appeal of psychoanalysis, like some alternative treatments for cancer, must have resided in the alternative it offered to medical therapies. Better to lie on a couch and be shocked to discover one's sexual secrets than to sit on an electrode and be shocked with electricity. Okay, that's crazy. This is crazy, man. Back then, they were like burning your penis. You know what I mean? They were like cutting off parts of your genitalia to try to cure whatever hysterics or neuroses you suffered from. That was crazy. Going to the comments, we have our guy Rick Jakes up in the comments. Okay, Rick Jakes is fiending for attention. And I want to invite Rick Jakes to a call-in show if there's something he wants to say to me. He seems to be very adamant about talking to me. But shout out to my guy Kamal for holding it down. It seems like a lot of Rick Jakes' comments are being held for review because he has no decorum. He has no tact. He is incapable, it seems to be, of any serious thought. You know what I mean? So anyway, we're going to continue here. Okay. An important change in thinking about hysteria began with Jean-Martin Charcot, born 1825 and died in 1893. And Freud brought Charcot's new ideas back with him to Vienna after studying with him in 1885 and 1886 is when Freud and him were studying in Vienna. While Charcot believed that there was an inherited organic factor in hysteria, he also proposed an important psychological source for hysteria. Charcot took up the study of a class of traumatic disorders called railway spine. Industrial workers, mostly in the railroads, hence the name, experience psychological and neurological symptoms that might plausibly have been caused by on-the-job accidents such as falls. Charcot argued that many such cases were less medical in origin than they were psychological, offering Freud a theory that would expand and enlarge. Many of those nervous accidents designated under the name railway spine, whether appearing in man or in woman, are simply hysterical manifestations. It is hysteria that is at the bottom of all these nervous lesions. Specifically, they are a consequence of the psychical nervous shock resulting from the accident. Frequently, moreover, they do not come on immediately after the accident, but sometime afterwards. When Charcot's work is examined more closely, we find emerging another dimension of hysteria, that it was a historically constructed disorder. Charcot believed that hysteria was a unitary disease having a single underlying pathology, traumatic shock to a hereditary weak nervous system, and a unique set of defining systems. His model was medicine as it was then emerging, in which specific symptoms clusters were being linked to specific pathogens, as in the case of tuberculosis already mentioned. Charcot thus assumed that hysteria, like tuberculosis, was a disease that existed independently of scientific medicine, awaiting precise description and effective cure. Many historians now believe that hysteria was not a pre-existing disease discovered by medicine, but a social role scripted by medicine and adopted by suggestible patients as a way of finding meaning in their lives. Hysteria is connected in the history of psychology with hypnotism, as we have learned. Charcot, along with French clinical psychologists, generally believed that the hypnotic trance was a genuine altered state of consciousness rooted in changes to the nervous system caused by induction of the trance. This belief would ultimately be defeated by the rival Nancy school of hypnosis, which regarded hypnotism as simply enhanced susceptibility to suggestion. Thus, the phenomenon of hypnotism are whatever the hypnotists want them to be, and the subject expects them to be. Similarly, the symptoms of hysteria were what doctors said they were in their diagnostic manuals, and what patients experienced them to be once they accepted the diagnosis of hysteria. In neither hypnotism nor hysteria was there an underlying disease entity or distinct mental, much less neurological state. The story of hysteria provides one of the central lessons to be learned from the history of psychology. Science is the view from nowhere that discovers and describes the world as it is, apart from human wishes, hopes, or thoughts. Psychological science is the quest to discover human nature. But human nature, even human psychopathology, does not exist entirely apart from human society. In the Middle Ages, exorcists sincerely thought demons were real, and their sermons, tracts, and questions led some people to sincerely think they were demon-possessed, and they acted as they thought the demon-possessed should. The expectation created the reality that confirmed the expectation. In the 19th century, psychiatrists such as Charcot thought hysteria was a real disease, and their diagnoses and teachings led some people to believe they were hysterics, and they learned to behave as they thought hysterics should. The expectation created the reality that confirmed the expectation. We should never forget that what psychologists say is human nature may create cultural scripts that ordinary people unwittingly enact, seeming to confirm as a scientific fact what is an artifact of the theories invented by psychologists. Unlike physics or chemistry, psychology can create its own reality and mistake it for universal truth. In Figure 9.2, entitled A Clinical Lecture at the Salpêtrière, J.M. Charcot is shown demonstrating a case of so-called grand hysteria to other physicians. This picture is emblematic of the challenges both of conducting psychology as a natural science and practicing it as a helping profession. Charcot believed that hysteria was a real disease marked by fixed symptoms. However, historians now believe that hysteria was a socially constructed pattern of behavior, not a natural disease discovered by psychology. In the painting, Charcot's patient is about to display one of hysteria's alleged symptoms, the arc du cercle. I can't pronounce that. His assistants are ready to catch her as she assumes a semicircular pose on the floor. However, the arc du cercle is not a symptom, but a learned behavior. Observe the drawing on the left, above the audience's head. The symptom is there for Charcot's patients to imitate. She has learned the symptoms she's supposed to have, and they, in turn, strengthen the physician's belief in the reality of a disease they invented. Psychologists assume, as did Charcot, that we investigate something, mind and behavior, that exists apart from our theories about it. A clinical lecture at the Salpêtrière provides a vivid reminder that psychology can create the realities it investigates, and that it can invent new diseases. In this way, hysteria intersects with the imageless thought controversy. In that controversy, experimental psychologists had to face up to the possibility of suggestion, that the beliefs of a laboratory could come to manufacture the facts psychologists wanted to explain. Thus, Cope's subjects produced imageless thoughts, while Titchener's did not. Charcot's mistaken theory of hysteria, that it was a pathological condition, could have been the equivalent of the imageless thought controversy in abnormal psychology. Some of Charcot's own supporters took it this way. Babinski abandoned the diagnosis of hysteria altogether, and Charcot's academic successor, J.J. Desserine, born 1849 and died in 1917, wrote, "The crises delineated by the grand hysterics are nothing other than coaching and imitation." Freud, however, continued on Charcot's path, seeking the source of the supposed disease hysteria. Let's go to the picture right here. This is the picture of our psychologist friend. I guess this is Charcot. Who is Charcot in this picture? The most important image of any psychologist to see and remember because it reveals a problem: human suggestibility. That has troubled psychology from the episode of mesmerism through the imageless thought controversy to the replication crisis in psychology today, because it shows how psychology can create facts to fit its theories, and how therefore it can do harm to people in society. We see J.M. Charcot, a major influence on Freud, demonstrating what he believed were symptoms of hysteria that could be exhibited through hypnosis before a distinguished group of European physicians with one of his regular patients, Blanche Whitman. You have probably seen this picture before, but in most texts, it is inexcusably cropped on the left side, hiding the script Whitman will use in her performance for the doctors. Similarly, hysteria was not a disease, but a social role adopted by many educated European and American women. Interesting here. I noticed this guy here is wearing a little Turkish hat. No, that's a landlord hat. That's a landlord hat that I have. Interesting. And here's the woman, basically acting out what a hysterical woman should be like. Anyway, that's pick-me behavior. We're calling this pick-me behavior, guys. In 2026, this is ultimate pick-meism. Anyway, let's continue here. So, let's continue. Charcot's ideas about hysteria created special difficulties for Freud. We have already seen that Freud's theory of the delayed action of psychological trauma was a version of Charcot's theory of the etiology of hysteria. But Charcot's assumption that hysteria was a unitary disease entity, abetted by Freud's deep commitment to a mechanistic conception of determinism, acquired from his training in the new reflex theory of the brain, caused problems for Freud's treatment of hysteria and of the mind more generally. We may again draw a useful comparison to tuberculosis. Tuberculosis had recently been shown to be a unitary disease uniquely caused by a singular pathogen, the tubercle bacillus. Freud, following Charcot, assumed similarly that hysteria was a unitary disease with a singular cause. We will see Freud frantically searching for a single source of the Nile, a single cause of hysteria. He changed his mind about what that cause was, but he never doubted that there was a one-to-one match between a set of symptoms, hysteria, and a single underlying cause. Driven by scientific ambition, he did not consider that some experiences sometimes cause certain kinds of unhappiness in some people, and that alleviating such suffering is a worthy, even noble undertaking. Instead, he forced his patients onto the Procrustean couch of his single-minded theories about the origin and cure of the neuroses, reproducing Charcot's error. Okay. This man has a lot of smoke for Freud. A lot of smoke. Anyway, we're going to come back to this. We're going to go to Studies in Hysteria, 1895, and Anna O. We're going to come back. We're going to come back to this section. You know what? We're going to read this section. We're going to read this section real quick. And then we're gonna pause. Okay, let's do this last section right here, then we're gonna pause. Studies in Hysteria, 1895, and Anna O. So, after returning from Paris and his studies with Charcot, Freud collaborated with his Viennese mentor, Joseph Breuer, who lived from 1842 and died in 1925. He collaborated on investigations into hypnosis and hysteria. This work culminated in Freud's first book, Studies in Hysteria. Breuer was a distinguished general physician and physiologist who, in 1880, first treated the patient whose case starts the story of psychoanalytic therapy. Called Anna O in studies, Bertha von Pappenheim was a young middle-class woman who, like many others, had to nurse a sick father, as Anna Freud later nursed her father. She fell prey to hysteria, primarily minor paralyses and difficulties in speaking and hearing. Treating her over a period of time, Breuer found that she gained some symptomatic relief by falling into auto-hypnosis and talking about her symptoms, recovering while doing so forgotten events that had caused them. For example, her inability to drink water from a glass was traced to having seen a dog licking water from a glass, and when she recovered this memory, she immediately drank from a glass again. Despite continued treatment, Anna O showed no continued improvement and, in fact, had to be hospitalized at one point. The claim in studies that she got well was false, and she did not experience a hysterical pregnancy, naming Breuer as the father, as analytic legend has it. In some respects, Anna invented psychotherapy, for she was one of a number of reported cases in the 19th century in which hysterical patients guided doctors to their cures. In Anna's case, she set her own timetable for therapy, placed herself in hypnosis, and led herself to the precipitating causes of her symptoms. A procedure she named the talking cure. She was an intelligent and forceful woman who went on to an important, influential, and successful career as the founder of social work in Germany. Despite being present at the creation, however, she never had kind words for psychoanalysis. Freud had nothing to do with the case of Anna O, but talked Breuer into using her case as a centerpiece of a theory about the cause and cure of hysteria. The case of Anna O was tidied up, and Freud contributed the rest of the case histories, which, together with a theoretical chapter, comprise studies in hysteria. Freud and Breuer presented studies in hysteria as an extension of Charcot's concept of traumatic hysteria to hysteria in general. Hysterical symptoms are related, sometimes clearly, sometimes in symbolic disguise, to a determined psychic trauma. In the theoretical chapter, Breuer and Freud argued that hysterics fall ill because they suffer mainly from reminiscence. That is, they experience an emotional trauma that is repressed. Instead of working through the negative emotions aroused by the event, the effect is strangulated, repressed, along with the memory itself. But the effect survives in the unconscious and manifests itself as a symptom. Under hypnosis, the experience is relived fully. The effect is unstrangulated or abstracted or abreacted, and the symptom connected with the event disappears. Ellensberg and Macmillan point out that in Anna O's case, the abreaction described in the book never took place. Breuer's rediscovered in clinical notes showed that Anna got relief from simply remembering events, not reliving them. Freud soon found that hypnosis was not the only way to tap unconscious wishes and ideas. Patients could slowly plumb their unconscious during sessions of uninhibited talk guided by the interpretations of the therapist. In 1896, Freud first used the term psychoanalysis to describe his new non-hypnotic technique. Studies in hysteria marks the transition from Freud's strictly physiological view of the mind and psychopathology, still on view in the project, to the so-called pure psychology of psychoanalysis. In the same year, Freud's rejection of Breuer began. Breuer, the scientist, was too cautious for Freud, the conquistador. Freud rejected Breuer because Freud was a hedgehog and Breuer was a fox. He confided in a letter to Fleiss in March 1st, 1896, according to him, Breuer, I should have to ask myself every day whether I am suffering from moral insanity or paranoia scientifica. Yet I regard myself as the more normal one. I believe that he will never forgive that in these studies I dragged him along and involved him in something where he unfailingly knows 3 candidates for the position of one truth and abhors all generalizations, regarding them as presumptuous. Will the two of us experience the same thing with each other? For his part, Breuer agreed. Freud is a man given to absolute and exclusive formulations. This is a psychical need which, in my opinion, leads to excessive generalizations. Breuer was the first of several friend collaborators used and then discarded by Freud. Years later, when Breuer was an old man hobbling along the street with his daughter, they saw Freud. Breuer threw his arms out in greeting, but Freud hurried past, giving no sign of recognition. An even more bitter estrangement awaited Wilhelm Fleiss. Damn, Freud was an asshole. Straight up asshole activity. Damn, boy. That was your old homeboy. He walked by like he ain't know him. Okay, what a dickhead. Fuck him. Okay. Anyway, we're going to take about an hour 15 break. So we might be back around 11 p.m. my time. We're going to come back around 11 p.m. my time. And we're going to be continuing reading this book. We are on page 265. We're on page 265, and the chapter ends at 281. So we have about 15 pages to go. So we read about half of the chapter, and I believe it's about 30 pages or so. So, yeah, we're going to come back and read the next 15 pages right here. And I'm just going to leave the camera on. The mic will probably be muted. But, yeah, I'll be here, and we'll come back. Y'all be easy. All right, welcome back to part 2 of episode 19 of A History of Psychology, from Antiquity to Modernity, written by Thomas Hardy Leahey. Pardon for anybody who's been on the live stream waiting for me to come back, or who is watching this in the playback and is like, how did this handsome man change clothes so quick? No, I chopped it up and edited and cut out the middle so that we can get back to it. Without further ado, we're going to finish off chapter 9 for the remainder of our time. I'm totally free right now. So we're going to be reading right here from Toward Pure Psychology, The Seduction Error, from 265 all the way to the end, The Party of Suspicion, 281 to 283, which leads to chapter 10. Let's get into it right here. Toward Pure Psychology, The Seduction Error. It was not just sexuality, but childhood sexuality that Freud claimed to find as the root of neuroses. If some of Freud's contemporaries found his emphasis on sex shocking, many more found his postulation of childhood sexuality. Asserting the existence of sexual feelings in childhood was central to the psychoanalytic strategy for explaining human behavior. Without childhood sexual drives, there could be no Oedipus complex, whose happy or unhappy resolution held the key to later normality or neurosis. Childhood sexuality and the Oedipus complex are also crucial to the whole idea of depth psychology. Freud located the causes of neurosis, and by implication happiness, entirely in the minds of his patients. Their personal situations were not the ultimate cause of sufferers' problems, Freud said. The feelings they had as children were. Consequently, therapy consisted of adjusting a patient's inner life, not changing the circumstances in which he or she lived. Health would come when a patient resolved the difficulties he or she had when he or she was 5 years old, not the difficulties he or she faced today. Psychoanalytic myths. The central episode in the history of psychoanalysis was Freud's abandonment of his seduction theory of hysteria, in which he had asserted that hysteria was caused by childhood sexual seductions, and its replacement by the Oedipus complex. Looking back on the history of psychoanalysis, Freud spoke of a curious early episode in which he was told by all of his women patients that their fathers had sexually seduced them. Freud said he soon came to realize that these stories were not true. The seductions had never really happened, but reflected unconscious fantasies of having sexual relations with the parent of the opposite sex. These fantasies were the core of the Oedipus complex, the crucible of personality in psychoanalytic theory. Man, Thomas Hardy got a lot of smoke for Freud, because essentially what he's saying here is like women were confessing to Freud that they had been sexually abused, and he said, no, they're making it up. They really wanted it. Okay, that's just wicked. Anyway, In recent years, especially following the publication of the complete and unexpurgated letters of Freud to Fleiss, the seduction mistake has occupied center stage in Freud's scholarship, and the ensuing controversies have generated, at times, more heat than light. I will first narrate the seduction mistake episode as it unfolds in the letters Freud wrote to Fleiss. Freud later tried to have these letters destroyed. Then, I will turn to modern critics' ideas about how and why Freud committed the seduction mistake, revealing that Freud misrepresented the event in his later statements. Before starting out, it is important to observe that the very foundations of psychoanalysis are at stake. Anna Freud, daughter and loyal disciple, wrote to Jeffrey Mason, controversial critic of the seduction episode. Keeping up the seduction theory would mean to abandon the Oedipus complex, and with it the whole importance of fantasy life, conscious or unconscious fantasy. In fact, I think there would have been no psychoanalysis afterwards. As he was writing the project, Freud was equally excited by making apparent progress on the cause and cure of hysteria. Writing to Fleiss on October 15, 1895, in the throes of writing fever, he asked, "Have I revealed the great clinical secret to you? Hysteria is the consequence of a pre-sexual sexual shock. The shock is later transformed into self-reproach, hidden in the unconscious, effective only as memories." 5 days later, Freud exclaimed, "Other confirmations concerning the neuroses are pouring in on me. The thing is really true and genuine." On October 31st, he told Fleiss that I perpetrated 3 lectures on hysteria in which I was very imprudent. I am now inclined to be arrogant. Freud sounds insane. He sounds crazy, bruh. So in April 1896, Freud delivered the paper that Krafft-Ebing called a scientific fairy tale, containing his seduction theory of hysteria. As we have seen in Studies in Hysteria, Freud and Breuer had proposed that the kernel of every hysterical symptom is a repressed traumatic event. Freud now claimed, based on the psychoanalytic recollection of his patients, that there was a single traumatic event at the heart of hysteria: seduction of sexually innocent children by their fathers. Here we see in operation Freud's commitment to finding a single cause for what he took to be the unitary disease of hysteria. Krafft-Ebing and the other donkeys of the medical establishment hooted at the theory for being a reversion to the pre-scientific conceptions of hysteria they had worked so hard to escape. However, Freud's enthusiasm for the seduction theory turned to ashes. On September 21st, 1897, Freud confessed to his friend Fleiss that perhaps the seduction theory was fairy tale after all. I want to confide in you immediately the great secret that has been slowly dawning on me in the last few months. I no longer believe my neurotica theory of neuroses. The stories of seduction told by his patients were untrue. They had not been seduced after all. Freud advanced 4 reasons for giving up the seduction theory. Therapeutic failure, number 1. Disappointment in my efforts to bring a single analysis to a real conclusion. The running away of previously successful patients. The absence of the complete successes on which I had counted. Believing that only a true theory of the mind could cure psychopathology. Freud was prepared to abandon the seduction theory because it did not cure patients. The surprise that in all cases, the father, not excluding my own, this phrase was omitted from the 1954 edition of the Freud-Fleiss letters, had to be accused of being perverse, when surely such widespread perversions are not very probable. Hysteria was a common disorder. If child sexual abuse was the sole cause of hysteria, it must follow that sexual abuse was rampant, and Freud considered that unlikely. Moreover, Freud knew of cases in which sexually abused children had been abused but had not become hysterical, ruling out the one-to-one mapping of disease onto a singular cause. Thirdly, the certain insight that there are no indications of reality in the unconscious, so that one cannot distinguish between truth and emotionally believed fiction. According there, Accordingly, there would remain the solution that the sexual fantasy invariably seizes upon the theme of the parents. In this sentence, Freud moves toward the concept of the Oedipus complex. The unconscious simply mistakes childhood sexual fantasies for real events and tells them to the therapist as seductions that really took place. Number 4, such stories are not found in delirium, when all mental defenses break down. In dementia, Freud believed, repressive defenses against unpleasant wishes and memories vanish. Thus, if people were regularly seduced as children, then psychotic patients, unafraid of such memories, should reveal them. Freud was so shaken that I was ready to give up 2 things, the complete resolution of neurosis and the certain knowledge of its etiology in childhood. Nevertheless, the conquistador felt no sense of weakness or shame. Instead, Freud wrote, I have more the feeling of a victory than a defeat, and he hoped that this doubt merely represents an episode in the advance towards further insight. In spite of all this, I am in very good spirits. At this point, Freud's self-analysis played its dramatic role in the tale of psychoanalysis. Freud reports the critical revelation, the discovery of his own childhood sexuality, in a letter to Fleiss on October 3, 1897. Freud claimed to have remembered an event on a train trip when he was 2.5 years old. My libido toward Martrem was awakened. We must have spent the night together, and there must have been an opportunity for seeing her nudam. On October 15th, Freud announced, this is the most essential thing I have at present, and promises to become of the greatest value to me if it reaches its end. Further, he declared his own experience to be universal. In his own case, Freud had learned of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and now I consider it a universal event in every childhood. In early childhood. It's a universal event in early childhood. This is quite a leap of faith from a single reconstructed memory to a claim of scientific universality. How did Freud make it, man? This man was crazy. Freud was crazy. Anyway, now Freud concluded we can understand the power of Oedipus Rex and Hamlet, as he suggested in his letter to Fleiss. Freud now regarded the seduction stories as Oedipal fantasies from childhood, falsely recalled as memories. This resolution allowed Freud to retain his treasured view that neurosis results from the unconscious reawakening of childhood events. In the old theory, the events were childhood sexual seductions. In the new theory, the events were childhood sexual fantasies. The psychoanalytic legend concludes by saying that Freud heroically discovered the existence of childhood sexuality in the Oedipus complex by giving up his old theory and constructing the new one out of his own. Unsparingly honest self-interrogation. The probable truth. A consensus has begun to emerge among historians of psychoanalysis about what really happened in the seduction mistake episode. It appears that Freud either bullied his parents into reporting childhood seductions. It appears that Freud either bullied his patients into reporting childhood seductions or foisted such stories upon them, and he later lied about the whole seduction episode. A place to begin the revisionist account of the seduction episode is to examine the papers on the etiology of hysteria that Krafft Ebing said was a scientific fairy tale. The psychoanalytic legend initiated by Freud says that Freud was told by his female patients of being sexually seduced by their fathers. However, in Freud's published reports, the seducers were never the parents. They were usually other children, sometimes adults such as tutors or governesses, and occasionally an unspecified adult relative, but never a parent. Either Freud misdescribed the data to his fellow psychiatrists, or there were no Oedipal fantasy stories at all. More serious is the likelihood that Freud's patients never told him any stories or sexual abuse. So Freud was literally just making up shit? That's crazy. And he ended up becoming the most famous, psychologist ever. Anyway. Freud's critics have demonstrated that, from early in his career, Freud believed in sexual causes of neurotic disorders, and we have seen that Freud believed in Charcot's traumatic theory of hysteria. The seduction mistake was the result of combining these beliefs with Freud's aggressive therapeutic techniques. Although psychoanalysis eventually became the epitome of non-directive therapy, in which the therapist says very little, offering interpretive insights only as gentle nudges to the patient, Freud's actual practice was very different. At least in his early cases, Freud was highly directive and interpretive, showering his patients with sexual interpretations of their condition and wearing them down until they agreed with his view of their behavior. As befits a conquistador, Freud was supremely confident in his ability to discern secrets hidden even from a patient's own consciousness. No mortal can keep a secret if his lips are silent. He chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. Freud wrote of finding facts that I did not hesitate to use against her, the patient Dora. In the paper he gave to the Vienna Society, Freud described boldly demanding confirmation of our suspicions from the patient. We must not be led astray by initial denials, and he reported having at least once laboriously forced some piece of knowledge on a patient. His patients certainly resisted. The fact is that these patients never repeat these stories spontaneously, nor do they ever present the physician with the complete recollection of a scene of this kind. Before conquering the world, Freud first conquered his patients. Freud enjoyed forcing his patients to accept what he, Freud, regarded as the truth. And he interpreted every resistance as a sign that he was getting near a great secret. Given Freud's therapeutic technique, if he were on the path of childhood sexuality and a single traumatic cause of hysteria, as his critics show he was, surely his patients would produce stories to support it. Cioffi claims that Freud's patients invented the stories of their seductions in order to placate their conqueror, who was, no doubt, pleased to find verification of his hypotheses. Esterson and Schatzman think he deduced the seduction stories and forced them on his patients. In either case, it is no wonder his patients ran away. Cioffi, Esterson, and Schatzman argue that at some point, Freud realized that the seduction stories were false, and he was put in the position of explaining how that could be so while at the same time maintaining psychoanalytic therapy as a means for revealing scientific truth. He did so, they aver, by inventing the Oedipus complex and childhood sexuality. In the new formulation, the seduction stories about patients' outer lives as children are admitted to be false but remain wonderfully revealing about children's inner lives, displaying their Oedipal sexual fantasies about mother or father. Psychoanalysis became a doctrine concerned only with the inner life of human beings, and the psychoanalytic method was said to reveal that inner life even to the earliest days of childhood. In making this move, however, Freud later had to repudiate or bury what he had believed during the original seduction episode. In his later writings, Freud depicted himself as a naive, non-directive therapist, intentionally keeping my critical faculty in abeyance, when earlier he had prided himself on discovering the seduction by searching for it single-mindedly. He said that he had been stunned to hear patient after patient describe being seduced by their fathers, when, in the paper of 1896, the seducers were adult strangers, older boys having sex with slightly younger sisters, or adults in whose care the child had been placed, never fathers. Sulloway offers another motive for Freud's later distortion of the episode of the seduction mistake. Sulloway contends that the psychoanalytic legend was meant to obscure the influence of Fleiss on Freud, specifically the fact that Freud got the idea of childhood sexuality from Fleiss, not from his self-analysis. Sulloway calls it the theft of the Fleissian id. Fleiss is, in retrospect, a man with odd ideas from which Freud wanted to distance himself. Fleiss believed in a theory of biorhythms based on 23-day male and 28-day female cycles, whose combination in complex permutations could explain events such as births and deaths. Freud, for a time, believed Fleiss's theory wholeheartedly. His letters to Fleiss, often containing calculations concerning himself and calculations concerning the birth of Anna under a pseudonym, were used in a publication by Fleiss. Fleiss believed that the nose plays an important role in the regulation of human sexual life, and that surgery on the nose could cure sexual problems like masturbation. Freud himself submitted at least once to Fleiss's knife. They were just two crazy guys. Sulliway argues that in the aftermath of the failure of the project, Freud adopted almost in toto Fleiss's theories of sexuality and human development, while systematically concealing that he had done so. In Sulliway's account, Fleiss conceived of the id and Freud took it over without acknowledgement. Fleiss's influence on Freud was so thoroughgoing that it cannot be briefly summarized. But in the present context, the most important borrowing is the concept of childhood sexuality. Fleiss campaigned for the view that children had sexual feelings, advancing, for example, observations of his own children in support. Moreover, Fleiss believed in the innate bisexuality of human beings, an important component of the biorhythm theory and later a central thesis in the psychoanalytic theory of psychosexual development. At what proved to be their last personal meeting, Freud boasted of his discovery of the innate childhood bisexual nature of human beings, and Fleiss tried to remind him who had the idea first. Freud persisted in claiming personal credit for the discovery, and Fleiss, fearing his ideas were being stolen, withdrew from the relationship. In his last letters to Freud, Fleiss has gotten wind of Freud's ideas on sexuality and reproaches Freud for taking sole credit for them. Freud protests his innocence, and the correspondence ends. Consequence of the seduction episode: fantasy trumps reality. In the wake of the seduction episode, Freud ceased to see the causes of neurotic suffering in his patients' lives, but located them in their mental lives. Indeed, critics of Freud, including some psychoanalysts, accused Freud of becoming insensitive, sometimes brutally so, to the life problems of his patients. Two cases from Freud's practice illustrate his new attitude. The first was a dramatic episode that was deleted from the original official publication of the Freud-Fleiss letters. Freud had a patient named Emma Eckstein who suffered from stomach pains and menstrual irregularities. We have already seen that Freud regarded masturbation as pathogenic, and he apparently agreed with Fleiss that masturbation caused menstrual problems. Moreover, Fleiss taught that nasal surgery could eliminate masturbation and hence the problems it caused. Freud brought Fleiss to Vienna to perform surgery on Emma Eckstein's nose. The operation may have been Fleiss's first. In any event, post-operative recovery did not go well. Eckstein suffered pain, bleeding, and discharge of pus. Ugh! Freud eventually called in a Viennese doctor who removed from Eckstein's nose a half-meter of gauze that Fleiss had incompetently left behind. At this point, Eckstein hemorrhaged, turned pale, and very nearly died. Freud was so shattered by the sight of Emma Eckstein seemingly dying that he fled and was revived by brandy brought by the doctor's wife. This is ghetto. Just ghetto. Just ghetto is all hell. Remarkably, I think Eckstein stayed in therapy with Freud. She continued to suffer pain and occasional, sometimes violent, bleeding from the nose. Initially, Freud recognized that her suffering was Fleiss's fault. He wrote to Fleiss, "So we had done her an injustice. She was not abnormal, but suffered from Fleiss's mistake, and by extension, Freud's mistake in subjecting her to Fleiss's bungling ministrations." However, eventually Freud returned to a psychological interpretation of Eckstein's bleeding. Just over a year after her brush with death, on June 4, 1896, Freud wrote that Eckstein's continued bleeding was due to wishes. The causes of her suffering lay in her mind, not her damaged nose. As an even more revealing case is fragments of an analysis of a case of hysteria, describing Freud's admittedly unsuccessful treatment of an 18-year-old woman known as Dora, Ida Bauer. Shortly after the publication of Interpretation of Dreams, Dora's father, a successful businessman and former patient of Freud's, brought her in for therapy. Dora was suffering from symptoms Freud thought were neurotic, primarily shortness of breath and a cough. As therapeutic sessions proceeded day by day, Freud saw his patients 6 days a week. Freud discovered that Dora came from a family whose tangled intrigues would do justice to a soap opera today. Dora's father's real reason for seeking Dora's treatment was to make her less unhappy about her affair with Frau K. The K's were close friends of the Bowers, seeing each other regularly and vacationing together. On a vacation, Dora deduced the affair from her father's rearranging hotel rooms to have convenient access to Frau K. Dora's mother suffered, Freud opined, from housewife's psychosis, obsessive neatness, and had long since ceased having sexual relations with her husband. Dora objected most of all to the advances of her K, whose wife had stopped sleeping with him, who had twice attempted to force himself on Dora, the first attempt coming when she was 13. Her K arranged to be alone in his place of business with Dora, ostensibly to watch a parade, but he suddenly grabbed her, pressed himself against her, and kissed her. Dora fled in disgust, tried to avoid her K, but nevertheless had to turn down a proposition from him 2 years later. Just ghetto. Ghetto, ghetto, ghetto. Freud's reaction to the scene is remarkable. This was surely just the situation to call up a distinct feeling of sexual excitement in a girl of 14. Freud miscalculated the age. Freud miscalculated the age. All right, so anyway, this was surely just a situation to call up a distinct feeling of sexual excitement in a girl of 14 who had never before been approached. The behavior of this child of 14 was already entirely and completely hysterical. I should without question consider a person hysterical in whom an occasion for sexual excitement elicited feelings that were preponderantly or exclusively unpleasurable, instead of the genital sensation that would certainly have been felt by a healthy girl in such circumstances. Dora was overcome by the unpleasurable feeling of disgust. Freud was especially puzzled since I happened to know her K. He came with Dora and Dora's father to Freud's office, and he was still quite young and of prepossessing appearance. At this point in his career, Freud was an aggressive therapist, and he quickly used against Dora every interpretation he could. Playing with her purse during therapy represented her desire to masturbate. Her cough represented hidden thoughts of Frau K. Performing fellatio on her father, and therefore Dora's secret wish to do the same. Wow. Not surprisingly, Dora was a patient who ran away. Freud ascribed his therapeutic failure to unanalyzed transference. Dora had transferred her sexual desires from her K, whom Freud was certain Dora secretly desired, to himself, and he had not taken due notice of it at the time. Freud said nothing about possible countertransference from a middle-aged man no longer sleeping with his wife to Dora, an attractive adolescent girl. Ugh, what a crazy man. What a sick, crazy man. Anyway, in Dora's case, we find Freud pushing all responsibility for hysteria onto his patient. Dora should have been sexually excited by her K's attentions. The disgust she felt was a symptom of her hysteria, not the cause of her distaste for the handsome her K. In 1895, when Freud still believed in the seduction theory, Freud had treated another young woman on whom sexual advances had been made, and he wrote of the horror by which a virginal mind is overcome when it is faced for the first time with the world of sexuality. In sum, the Dora case is typical of Freud's dismissal of family dynamics and other current influences on patients' troubles. Depth psychology imputed to the unconscious full sovereignty over mental health and mental illness, making patients solely responsible for their health. Moving on to the basic tenets of Freud's psychoanalysis. Over the course of Freud's letters to Fleiss, psychoanalysis developed from a reductive physiological theory that emphasized real experience to a theory that was purely psychological. In the first decades in the 20th century, Freud published his ideas in a series of books and papers, the latter in journals he controlled. We will consider Freud's official psychoanalysis under three heads: interpretation, the dynamics and structure of the mind, motivation and personality, and his extension of psychoanalysis as a theory of culture and society. Interpretation. The first book in the new psychoanalysis was The Interpretation of Dreams, that Freud regarded as his masterpiece. In a letter to Fleiss, Freud hoped that a plaque would be erected someday saying, "In this house on July 24th, 1895, the secret of dreams was revealed to Dr. Sigmund Freud." The insight Freud valued so highly was that a dream is not a meaningless collection of experiences, but is the royal road to the unconscious, a clue to the innermost recesses of the personality. That dreams have meaning was not a new idea, as Freud acknowledged, but it was out of step with the received academic opinion of his time. Most thinkers, including Wundt, assigned little importance to dreams, believing them to be only confused nighttime versions of waking mental processes. Freud sided instead with poets and shamans in valuing dreams as symbolic statements of a reality unavailable to waking experience. In the long run, The Interpretation of Dreams was by far the most influential of his works, and the only one that remains worth reading today. Damn. Okay, everything of enduring influence in psychoanalysis stems from it. In the book, Freud tries to glue together the apparent harvest of his clinical studies of hysteric patients on the one hand with the psychologized version of the mechanistic physiological version of mental processes offered in his Project for Scientific Psychology on the other. The joining never really cemented, and as psychoanalysis developed first in Freud's hands and then in those of his followers during the 20th century, Freud's out-of-date biology, both physiological and evolutionary, faded away, leaving the interpretation of the meaning of dreams, behavior, and literature as his greatest contribution to Western thought. As Summers has remarked, there were two Freud: the hermeneuticist, that is, a close reader of texts who searches for meanings that sometimes even a text author did not know were there. Nevertheless, let us begin with Freud's scientific, that is, causal theory of how dreams arise in the course of a night's sleep. It's found in the last chapter of Interpretations and repeats ideas from the project, with less stress on neuronal specifics. Freud's thesis, first adumbrated or illustrated in Studies in Hysteria, was that all we carry within ourselves Freud's thesis, first adumbrated in Studies in Hysteria, was that we all carry within ourselves repressed desires that constantly seek access to the control of behavior. As long as we are awake, our ego or conscious self represses these wishes, but during sleep, consciousness lapses and repression weakens. As a result, the formerly repressed desires seek to control the motor centers of the brain and enact themselves in behavior. However, during sleep, the motor centers are switched off and the wishes reverse the usual direction of nervous transmission from stimulus to response and move regressively, as Freud put it, to the sensory areas of the brain, where they are experienced as if they were happening in reality. Let's go to the figure right here. Process of dream production. We have our psychic sensor. This creates a dream or monitors the dream. We have repressed material in the dream and dream as experienced. And the latent content is under the repressed material. The manifest content is the dream as experienced. And it's also worked. And then we have the dream analysis, the royal road to the unconscious. The manifest content leads to the latent content. Basically, what you see in the dream will highlight your subconscious, right? Okay. However, should we experience what we secretly desire, such as having sex with a parent, Freud claimed that we would be so offended and frightened that we would wake up in order to repress it. Thus, a process called dream work kicks in. We have a moral sense, the psychic sensor, that remains alert during sleep, and as the name implies, it forbids access of forbidden wishes to consciousness. Dream work recasts the dream, encoding what's forbidden into acceptable thoughts and experiences that nevertheless point to what's repressed. Thus, an act of sex with one's mother might be represented as inserting a key into the lock of the parent's door and entering a room ordinarily off limits to a child. Dreaming is thus a compromise that protects sleep, for dreams are hallucinatory, disguised expressions of repressed ideas. Freud grew up in an era of political censorship, when governments forbade the expression of political desires, particularly those that might threaten their power. But subversive groups found ways to encode their messages indirectly in order to evade censorship. And Freud simply extended the notion to dreaming. Dreams were the subversive political literature of desires repressed by a threatened self. Freud's theory of dreams suggested a way to extend psychoanalysis to interpreting myths, legends, and works of art. We have already seen that in writing to Fleiss about his alleged discovery of the Oedipus complex, Freud claimed to understand the enduring appeal of plays such as Oedipus, Rex, and Hamlet. In subsequent decades, psychoanalysis exerted great influence on literary criticism. Freud's dream theory, which represented a general model of the mind as a multi-layered system in which the unconscious shapes thought and behavior according to a particular set of rules, provided the foundation for the unmasking function of psychoanalysis so important to its hermeneutical employment by later social and literary critics. According to psychoanalysis, dreams and by extension neurotic symptoms, slips of the tongue, and indeed all civilized behavior are never what they appear to be because they are motivated by base and disgusting sexual and aggressive wishes. In the hands of literary critics, psychoanalysis could be used to argue that works of art are never what they seem, expressing yet hiding the artist, and if the work was popular or controversial, the audience's deepest needs and conflicts. To social critics, psychoanalysis suggested that social practice, institutions, and values existed to enforce and at the same time hide rule by reprehensible value systems, usually capitalism, and reprehensible elites, usually white males. In therapy, art, and politics, the psychoanalytic line of argument placed the therapist and critic in a privileged position, beyond the subterfuge of the unconscious, uniquely capable of revealing the truth to deluded clients, audiences, and citizens. Moving on to the dynamics and structures of the mind. Let's go to motivation. Although Freud's ideas about childhood sexuality and the Oedipus complex were worked out in the 1890s, it was not until 1905 that Freud made them public in a set of 3 brief lectures, published in 3 essays in the theory of sexuality. It is in these essays that we also learn about Freud's incredibly narrow conception of human motivation. Earlier psychologists postulated a wide range of human desires, from the ancient Greek desire for glory through to the rich faculty psychologies of the Scots or Franz Joseph Gall. Even David Hume, a parsimonious empiricist, attributed to human beings unique motives such as moral sense, and even utilitarians recognized non-biological sources of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Freud, however, said that human beings had no motives not shared with animals, and his list of animal motives was very short: sex, hunger, thirst, and self-defense. Later, he added aggression, but in the 3 essays, sex was front and center. And it was that Freud finally introduced the world at large to his ideas about childhood sexuality and the Oedipus concept that he had developed during the episode of the seduction mistake. Freud also discussed adult sexuality, which he said begins in puberty when maturational changes reawaken and transmute the dormant sexual instincts from childhood. At this time in the healthy person, sexual desire is directed to a person of the opposite sex, and reproductive genital intercourse becomes the goal. The instincts of childhood sexuality now serve, through the kissing and caressing of foreplay, genital drives that create the arousal necessary for actual coitus. In perverse individuals, the pleasure associated with some infantile instinct is great enough to replace genital activity altogether. The neurotic is overcome by adult sexual demands and converts his or her sexual needs into symptoms. Freud's discussion of psychosexual development suggested to his readers that raising a healthy, that is, non-neurotic and non-perverse child was extraordinarily difficult. In this way, Freud aided the rise of applied psychology, as psychologists wrote books and dispensed advice about something that parents had been doing for millennia, but which they now feared they had been doing wrong. Parents could not, it seemed, trust their intuitions, but needed to turn to science for advice on rearing their children. In 1920, Freud revised his theory of motivation and beyond the pleasure principle. Perhaps because of his own suffering from intractable cancer of the jaw, he endured numerous operations, and his daughter Anna had to painfully replace a prosthesis in his jaw every day. Damn. And perhaps because of the carnage of World War I, Freud became increasingly pessimistic about human nature. And beyond the pleasure principle, Freud proposed that the aim of all life is death. Freud here gave psychoanalytic expression to an old idea, that we are born in order to die. In a sermon from 1630, John Donne had said, "We have a winding sheet in our mother's womb, which grows with us from our conception, and we come into the world wound up in that winding sheet, for we come to seek a grave." Freud's argument is based on his conceptions of instincts as drives and behavior as motivated by drive reduction. Unsatisfied instincts give rise to states of arousal, which the organism seeks to reduce by engaging in behavior that satisfies the instinct. Satisfaction is only temporary, so, in time, the instinct must be gratified anew, causing a cyclical process of arousal and satisfaction that Freud called the repetition compulsion. It appears then that the optimum state sought by every living thing is complete oblivion, freedom from arousal. The wheel of the repetition compulsion is broken by death, when the aim of living, tension reduction, is permanently reached. There lies within us, Freud concluded, a drive toward death along with drives toward life. The ego instincts such as hunger and thirst preserve the life of the individual, and the sexual instincts preserve the life of the species. So Freud bundled them together as the life instincts, named eros, after the Greek word for love. Opposed to the life instincts is the death instinct, or thanatos, the Greek word for death. Eros and thanatos are mutually repressing. Thanatos provides the energy by which the ego, at the behest of the moralizing superego, represses sexual wishes, and Eros provides the energy to repress the death instinct from immediately fulfilling its lethal wish. Postulation of the death wish provided a solution to the problem of aggression. In Freud's earlier theory, aggressive acts were deemed to occur out of frustrated ego or sexual needs. Thus, animals fought out of self-defense or over food, water, territory, or reproductive opportunities. In the new theory, aggression was an autonomous drive in itself. Just as sexual instincts could be rechanneled from the proper biological objects, so too could the death instincts be redirected away from bringing about the death of the organism. Eros could be a time repress, thanatos, suicidal aggression. Eros could, for a time, repress thanatos, suicidal aggression. So your search for love can repress your desire to kill yourself, I guess. Okay. Eros could, for a time, repress thanatos' suicidal aggression. But the necessary result was aggression displaced onto others. Freud's new theory did not win universal acclaim among later analysts, many of whom preferred to accept Freud's earlier, less pessimistic view of human nature. But both theories of aggression appear in later psychoanalytic psychology. The first concept of aggression as caused by frustration surfaced in social learning theories, aggression hypotheses. And the second conception of aggression as a necessary part of nature was reasserted by the ethologist, who stressed the adoptive value of an aggressive drive, if not a suicide drive. Moving on to personality. The concept of the psychological unconscious is the concept of the psychological unconscious is the one truly indispensable shibboleth of psychoanalysis, the consummation of psychoanalytic research. The idea did not originate with Freud and was and remains controversial. We do not find the concept at all in ancient and medieval authors. As we have seen, the dominant psychologist in those centuries was Aristotle, who did not think of the mind in terms of consciousness at all, but in terms of function. The idea of a conscious mental space and a non-conscious mental state made no sense in his system, which defines soul as the totality of life processes. Recall that he attributed a soul to both plants and animals, and said that what was unique to humans was the ability to form universal concepts, not a special form of experience. Descartes replaced Aristotle's functional conception of the human soul with the idea of consciousness, a special kind of experience, self-awareness, limited to human beings. In Descartes' model discussed earlier, humans possessed an interior mental space, the Cartesian theater, from which they see a projection of the world contrary to animals, which he believed were just soulless machines. However, once thinkers came to accept the idea of an inner conscious space, the possibility of an inner mental space that is in some respects similar to consciousness arose. Kant's transcendental ego was not conscious, and because it could not be introspectively observed, Kant concluded that psychology could not be a science. But the post-Kantian idealists, such as Nietzsche and their romantic allies, made much use of the unconscious. Leibniz postulated petite, that is, non-conscious perceptions, and was followed in this by Fechner. The philosopher and educator Johann Friedrich Herbart, born 1776 and died in 1841, proposed a complex psychology based on the idea that ideas rose and fell from unconsciousness and back again as they became more or less charged with energy. Furthermore, mesmerism, hypnosis, and Charcot's ideas about hysteria were built on the idea of unconscious thought and unconscious influence. Finally, the Wurzburg psychologists at least flirted with the notion that their imageless thoughts were ripples of unconscious thought on the surface of consciousness. Wundt, as we saw, originally embraced the idea of the unconscious, but came to reject it. Instead, he adopted the framework proposed by physiologists in which consciousness and mind were identical. So-called unconscious processes were simply brain processes. So the mere idea of an unconscious realm of mind was not original with Freud, though he and his followers tended to present it as his discovery or invention. In what follows, we will play off Freud's uses of the unconscious with William James's rejection of it as a myth. Freud proposed two theories about the unconscious. The first had been termed the topographical model because it views the mind as a space in which ideas move between consciousness and unconsciousness. Going to the college... Kamal says, psychology as a science, good debate. Very, very interesting. I mean, that's what this book seems to be wrestling with, you know. Is psychology a natural science or something else? Is it a type of philosophy? Is consciousness real? Is the mind-body problem, how can it be solved? Like, that's what the book seems to be wrestling with. Continuing here. So, Freud proposed two theories about the unconscious. The first had been termed the topographical model because it views the mind as a space in which ideas move between consciousness and unconsciousness. The topographical model was Freud's elaboration on the way of ideas developed by Descartes, Locke, and their philosophical successors. However, the idea of a mental unconscious was controversial in psychology. For most British philosophers, an idea was by definition conscious. Underneath consciousness lay brain processes, not unconscious thought. And Freud endorsed this position in his Project for a Scientific Psychology. After abandoning the project, Freud developed a theory of mind more in keeping with the German tradition of Leibniz and Kant, for whom much of mental life lay beyond the reach of introspection. Freud was not alone. By the turn of the century, students of human affairs were increasingly regarding human behavior as being caused by processes and motives lying outside awareness. The hypnotic trance and the power of post-hypnotic suggestion, with which Freud was familiar with his studies with Charcot and his own use of hypnosis in therapy, seemed to point to a realm of mind apart from consciousness. Schopenhauer spoke of the wild beast within the human soul, and Nietzsche said consciousness is a surface. Freud acknowledged Nietzsche's grasp of unconscious dynamics in psychopathology of everyday life, when he quoted Nietzsche's pithy aphorism, "I have done that, says my memory. I could not have done that, says my pride, and remains inexorable. Finally, my memory yields." Nevertheless, the hypothesis of unconscious mental states was not the dominant one among academic psychologists, who viewed mind as coextensive with consciousness. For them, the science of mind, psychology, was the science of consciousness. Freud's most important instructor in philosophy, Franz Brentano, rejected the unconscious, and he was joined in his views by the preeminent American psychologist, William James. Brentano and James were united in holding the doctrine called, by Brentano, the infallibility of inner perception, and by James, es est sentiri. That's Latin. I don't know what that means. Anyway, according to this view, ideas and consciousness were exactly what they appeared to be. Ideas and consciousness were exactly what they appeared to be. So there's no hidden unconscious or interpretation to be made. That is, ideas and consciousness were not compounded by what James called the Kantian machine shop of the unconscious, out of simpler mental states. The Gestalt view was similar, arguing that complex wholes were given directly in consciousness without hidden mental machinery behind the stage of experience. It is important to realize that neither Brentano nor James denied the validity of a purely descriptive use of the term unconscious. They recognized that behavior or experience may be determined by factors of which humans are not aware, but they believed that the existence of unconscious causes of experience and behavior did not require the positing of unconscious mental states. They proposed a number of alternative mechanisms by which mind and behavior might be unconsciously shaped. James fully treated the problem in the Principles of Psychology. James pointed out that consciousness is a brain process, and we are not aware of the states of our brain. Our cerebellum keeps us balanced upright, for example, but to explain upright posture, we need not suppose that the cerebellum is unconsciously computing the laws of physics. So memories, not now present in consciousness, exist as traces in the brain, dispositions toward consciousness awaiting activation. We need not posit an unconscious library of memories. Other apparently unconscious mental states may be explained as lapses in attention or memory. Apprehended stimuli, to use Wundt's terms, are conscious, but because they are not apperceived, they may not be remembered. If we are influenced by them, we might be disposed to think they influenced us unconsciously, when in fact their presence in consciousness was merely no longer recollected. In 1960, George Sperling would show that, in Wundt's letter perception experiment, apprehended letters were perceived briefly but forgotten during the time it took the subjects to pronounce the letters they had seen. A dream of memory we cannot recover need not be thought to be unconscious because repressed, but unconscious because forgotten. Finally, phenomena such as hypnotism and the existence of multiple personalities may be explained by the dislocation or disassociation of consciousness rather than the existence of an unconscious. That is, within the brain of a single individual, two distinct consciousnesses may be present, unknown to each other, rather than a single consciousness beset by unconscious forces. Positing an unconscious seemed to James and other psychologists to be scientifically dangerous because the unconscious, by definition, lies outside inspection. It can easily become a convenient vehicle by which to construct untestable theories. As James wrote, the unconscious is the sovereign means for believing what one likes in psychology, and of turning what might become a science into a tumbling ground for whimsies. Freud spelled out his conception of the unconscious mind in detail in The Unconscious. He offered two main arguments for postulating the existence of an unconscious mental realm. The first, incontrovertible proof, was Freud's claim for the therapeutic success of psychoanalysis. He held that a theory will work if and only if it is based on a true theory of the mind. And we have seen Freud relying on his argument as this argument as providing one reason for abandoning his seduction theory of hysteria. His second argument for belief in the existence of the unconscious was based on the philosophical issue of other minds raised by Descartes. Freud argued that just as we infer the presence of mind in other people, and perhaps animals, from observable utterances and actions, so we should in our own individual case as well. All the acts and manifestations which I notice in myself must be judged as if they belonged to someone else, another mind within the self. Freud acknowledged that this argument leads logically to the assumption of another, second consciousness within oneself, but notwithstanding James's espousal of this very hypothesis, Freud thought it unlikely to win approval for psychologists of consciousness. How is the unconscious any different than the soul? Anyway, moreover, Freud asserted this other consciousness possesses characteristics which seem alien to us, even incredible, to the point that it is preferable to regard them as possessed not by second consciousness but by unconscious mental processes. Freud proceeded to distinguish several senses of the term unconscious. We have already recognized a descriptive usage on which Freud and psychologists of consciousness agreed, namely that we are not always fully conscious of the causes of our behavior. Disagreement began with Freud's topographical conception of an unconscious mental state or unconscious mental space, the unconscious where ideas and wishes live when they are not present to consciousness. Freud's scheme was like Nietzsche's. Consciousness is a surface lying over a vast and unknown realm, sensed dimly, if at all. In Freud's description of the mind, all perceptions and thoughts are first registered in the unconscious, where they are tested for acceptability to consciousness. Perceptions and thoughts that pass the censorship test may become conscious. If they fail, they will not be allowed into consciousness. Applied to perception, this analysis provided the foundation for the important New Look in Perception movement of the 1950s. Passing the test of censorship does not directly lead to consciousness, but only makes an idea capable of becoming conscious. Ideas that are available to consciousness in this way reside in the preconscious, which Freud did not regard as importantly different from consciousness. More important and psychoanalytically interesting was the fate of ideas or wishes that did not pass muster with the mental censor. These ideas and wishes are often very powerful, constantly seeking expression. Because they are repugnant, however, they must continually be forced to remain unconscious. This dynamic unconscious is created by repression, the act of actively and forcefully opposing the entrance to consciousness of unacceptable thoughts. In the unconscious, Freud had worked out the descriptive, topographical, and dynamic usages of the consciousness. In the unconscious, Freud had worked out the descriptive, topographical, and dynamic usages of the unconscious. However, implicit in his treatment of the unconscious was an additional structural meaning that Freud developed into a new conception of personality, not as a space, but as a set of interacting structures. The unconscious was not simply a place in space, topographical use, containing readily available thoughts, the preconscious, and repressed thoughts, the dynamic unconscious. It is also a separate system of mind from consciousness. and it follows its own fantastical principles. In contrast to consciousness, it is exempt from logic, emotionally unstable, lives as much in the past as the present, and is wholly out of touch with external reality. The systematic or structural conception of the unconscious became increasingly important to Freud and was central to the later restructuring of his picture of the mind. The topographical model of the mind as a collection of spaces, conscious, preconscious, dynamic, unconscious, was replaced by a structural model. In the new theory, personality was said to be comprised of three distinct mental systems. The first was the innate, irrational, and gratification-oriented id, the old systematic conception of the unconscious. The second was the learned, rational, reality-oriented ego, consciousness plus the preconscious. The third was the moralistically irrational superego, the censor, composed of moral imperatives inherited by Lamarckian evolution. The old dichotomy of consciousness and unconsciousness, Freud said, begins to lose significance with the adoption of the structural viewpoint. All right, we're going to move on to culture. Culture is on page 277 right here. And in the chapter, if I can click, it won't let me click. Okay, thank you. Anyway, culture is the last section of the basic tenets of Freud's psychoanalysis, right? And then after that, we only have one more section, psychoanalysis as a movement, and that goes to page 281. So we have about, about 7 more pages to go, 7 or 8 more pages to go. We're going to take like a quick 10-minute break right here. Quick 10-minute break. We're going to come back and finish reading the rest of chapter 9, these last 8 pages, and then call it a night, okay? So, go get a snack, smoke a cigarette, and we'll be back for the final 8 pages. All right, welcome back to part 3, the final part of episode 19 of our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is a history of psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. Hopefully you enjoyed the break. Now we're going to wrap up all of chapter 9. We're picking up here on the third part of the basic tenets of Freud's psychoanalysis, which is the section called Culture. And we will be reading the final 8 pages or so of chapter 9, all the way to 283. So from page 277 to 283, without further ado, let's go here to culture. What did Freud have to say about culture and its effect on our psychology? In the last decade of his life, Freud began to apply psychoanalysis to significant historical and cultural questions. In doing so, he took positions that combined the more extreme forms of Enlightenment, naturalism, with currents of the counter-Enlightenment. With Voltaire, he said that religion is an oppressive illusion, but with Rousseau, he said that civilization is an enemy of human happiness. In the background hovers the brooding, pessimistic figure of Hobbes. Freud echoed the French naturalist and positivist in The Future of an Illusion. As we've seen, many philosophers, from Voltaire such as Comte, looked forward to religion's demise as scientific explanations of the world and human nature replaced outworn superstitious creeds. On the other hand, some sociologists and anthropologists, such as Emil Durkheim, born 1858 and died in 1917, believed that even if religious claims about God and an afterlife were not true, religious institutions were so fundamental to human social life that religious belief would never wither away. In The Future of an Illusion, Freud sided decisively with the first, more radical line of thought. Freud argued that religion is an illusion, a massive attempt at wish fulfillment. Religion, he said, is based on nothing more than our infantile feelings of helplessness and the consequent desire to be protected by an all-powerful parent who becomes God. Moreover, to Freud, religion is a dangerous illusion, for its dogmatic teachings stunt the intellect, keeping humankind in a childlike state. Religion is something to be outgrown as humans develop scientific resources and can stand on their own. The secret religious doubters are people who have outgrown religion but do not know it, and Freud addressed his work to them. Hobbes and Rousseau appear to psychoanalytic form in the most widely read of Hobbes and Rousseau appear in psychoanalytic form in the most widely read of all of Freud's works, Civilization and Its Discontents. In the Future of an Illusion, Freud wrote, every individual is virtually an enemy of civilization, and people feel as a heavy burden the sacrifices which civilization expects of them to make a communal life possible. Man's relation to society is the topic of Civilization and Its Discontents. The sense of guilt is the most important problem in the development of civilization. The price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of a sense of guilt. Each person seeks happiness, and, according to Freud, the strongest feelings of happiness come from direct satisfaction of our instinctual, especially sexual desires. Civilization, however, demands that we renounce to a large degree such direct gratification and substitute cultural activities in their stead. Such subliminal drives provide us less pleasure than direct gratification. To add to our discontents, we also internalize the demands of civilization as harsh superegos, burdening us with guilt for immoral thoughts as well as deeds. Civilized people are consequently less happy than their primitive counterparts. As civilization grows, happiness diminishes. On the other hand, civilization has its rewards and is necessary to human social life. Along with Hobbes, Freud feared that without a means of restraining aggression, society would dissolve into a war of all against all. Civilization is therefore necessary for the survival of all but the strongest, and at least partly serves Eros. Moreover, in return for repression, civilization gives us not only security, but also art, science, philosophy, and a more comfortable life through technology. Civilization thus presents a dilemma from which Freud saw no way out. On the one hand, civilization is the protector and benefactor of humanity. On the other hand, it demands unhappiness and even neurosis as payment for its benefactions. Near the end of the book, Freud hinted that civilization may vary in the degree of unhappiness they produce. Near the end of the book, Freud hinted that civilizations may vary in the degree of unhappiness they produce, a question he left for others to consider. Civilization and Its Discontents has proven to be Freud's most widely read and provocative work. Some writers claimed that only Western civilization is neurotic, and they anointed some utopia as savior, perhaps socialism or communism. Others taught that the only way out of Freud's dilemma was renunciation of civilization itself and a return to the simple physical pleasures of childhood. In 2017, both proposals seem from a bygone age. It's very interesting how socialism, communism, whatever, is never considered a part of Western civilization or the Western civilization canon, ideological canon, but I digress. Psychoanalysis as a movement. Shortly after the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud began to attract followers. Freud's first adherents were a few other practicing physicians interested in Freud's clinical methods. As we've seen, the pursuit of basic knowledge for its own sake and the pursuit of useful applications were often at odds. Carrying on traditions inherited from the Greeks, scientists often looked down at people who pursued practical knowledge instead of deep theoretical explanations of nature. The same was true in medicine in Freud's time. As Rudolf Virchow, a rare combination of scientist and healer, said, "It is said of the academic physician that he can do nothing, and of the practitioner that he knows nothing." Freud offered practicing physicians a therapy that seemed to be grounded in a general theory of the human mind, uniting science and therapeutics. Gradually, several doctors interested in Freud's practices met on Wednesdays at his house to discuss cases of interest from Freud's point of view, but without any aim of creating a new psychoanalytic profession. The appearance of the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality expanded Freud's appeal. Many intellectuals, especially those of a romantic bent, already thought that Victorian society was too straight-laced, bourgeois, and intolerant of the wilder sides of human nature, especially with regards to sex. These intellectuals joined Freud's Wednesday Society, and it grew from 5 members in 1902 to 22 in 1907, as it became the Wednesday Psychological Society. By becoming more organized, the Wednesday group began to grapple with questions of identity. What did it mean to be a psychoanalyst? Was it a science, a profession, an ideology? These issues came to a head in 1907 when Max Eitengron, born 1881 and died in 1943, an emissary from the Bergholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich, arrived in Vienna. The clinic proposed holding a Congress for Freudian psychology to be held at Salzburg under the auspices of the Bergholzli Clinic. The world outside Vienna had recognized Freud and the never-ending battle over the nature of psychoanalysis, and Freud's legacy to it began. Just as the generations of psychologists after Wundt changed psychology from the study of consciousness to the study of behavior and to added Wundt's pure science, just as the generation of psychology after Wundt changed psychology from the study of consciousness to the study of behavior, and added to Wundt's pure science applied psychology and the profession of clinical psychology, so the generations of psychoanalysts sought to change the nature of psychoanalysis. However, these developments played out differently in the two fields. The first organization for psychology, the American Psychological Association, defined itself as dedicated to the advancement of a psychological science, committed to no particular theoretical view of psychology, and it eventually came apart because of the competing economic interests of scientists on the one hand and the practitioners on the other. But the development of psychoanalysis was made more troublesome by its eventual commitment to an ideology. Freud's own theories about mind and motivation. Freud tolerated little deviation from his tenets. Moreover, psychoanalysis was more culturally contentious than academic psychology, and many outside observers believed that psychoanalysis was a pseudoscience or just plain humbug. The Bergholzli Psychiatric Clinic was venerable and world famous. Psychiatrists traveled from around the world, especially from the United States, to study there. The director of the clinic was Eugene Bleuler, born 1857 and died in 1939, a scientist of the insane rather than a therapist. His great claim to fame and influence was his reworking of the diagnosis of dementia precox by one of the most important scientifically minded psychiatrists, Emil Kraepelin, born 1856 and died 1926. Kraepelin learned scientific methodology by working with Wundt and went on to produce the first scientifically based psychiatric diagnosis, dementia precox, which he regarded as a form of senile dementia appearing in the young. Bleuler disagreed and argued that the minds of these patients were present but disturbed, and he renamed the disease schizophrenia. Unlike later psychoanalysis, Bleuler agreed with Kraepelin that schizophrenia was a biological disorder, unlike later psychoanalysts. Like Kraepelin, Bleuler was interested in Wundt's scientific psychology, especially Wundt's use of the free association test first proposed by Francis Galton. Bleuler assigned the application of the method to their psychiatric patients to his associate Carl Gustav Jung, born 1875 and died in 1961. His findings led Jung to propose the existence of the psychological complexes, clusters of associated ideas that lurked outside consciousness but which could manifest themselves in the mentally ill. Jung's findings were widely admitted and came to be used by psychiatrists and psychologists worldwide. Jung would first become Freud's chosen heir. Freud once called him his crown prince, and then his most important rival. Jung was important to Freud for two reasons. First, Jung was a famous established psychiatrist connected with the prestigious Berg-Holsey Clinic, and therefore Jung's association with Freud seemed to represent a scientific endorsement of Freud's ideas. Freud was a lone neurologist. Jung and Bleuler were respected scientists working in a large clinic. Second, Jung was a Gentile. Freud's early followers were almost entirely Jewish, and Freud feared that in a virulently anti-Semitic era, psychoanalysis might be ghettoized as a Jewish science. Given the fate of Jewish scientists in Nazi Germany, Freud's anxieties were well-founded. Freud, therefore, planned for Jung to become the head of the growing international psychoanalytic movement. The relationship went well for some years, but there were always signs of strain. One incident occurred on Freud's trip to the United States in 1909 to give a set of lectures on psychoanalysis. On the voyage, Freud and Jung got into an argument, and Freud fainted. Freud diagnosed unresolved Oedipal tensions with his adopted intellectual heir, Jung. So Freud wanted to have sex with Jung. What was Carl Jung, right? Carl Jung. Freud said, I fainted in the airport because I just realized I'm really horny for Carl Jung. What? This man was sick, yo. He was a sick bastard. How do you become the most famous person in a particular field of all time and you are basically a liar, a fraud, a cheat, and a sick fuck? Anyway. As psychoanalysis became an international movement, the differences between Freud and his followers became more serious and hard to resolve. Many thinkers were taken with Freud's formulation of the unconscious, though, as we have observed, he did not invent the concept. And Jung, in particular, traced his own ideas about the unconscious back to Kant and Romanticism. Also attractive was Freud's bringing the concept of energy to bear on the understanding of the mind. The concept of energy was important in 19th century physics and physiology. Hermann von Helmholtz proposed the principle of a single type of physical energy powering all movements, and the resulting concept of the conservation of energy, that the total energy in a system could be neither created nor destroyed. Freud's libido, part of the id, seemed to be a mental equivalent, a source of energy that always sought outlets in action or in dreams, that could not be destroyed, only repressed or redirected to alternative activities, thoughts, or fantasies. A sticking point for many of Freud's followers was Freud's insistence that libido was entirely sexual. At the end of the First Congress for the emerging International Psychoanalytic Association, Freud said to Jung that psychosexuality must be an unshakable bulwark of psychoanalysis. The 1910 Congress at Nuremberg that created the IPA ratified Jung as Freud's successor by electing him president. However, in other respects, the Congress was a disaster. Psychosexuality was enshrined as a core belief that members had to endorse. Some members, such as Bleuler, resigned, saying that Freud's monomania about sexuality had no place in science, a sentiment already expressed by Breuer. Purges began as dissenting analysts, such as Alfred Adler, born 1870-1937, were expelled for rejecting psychosexuality. Freud was kept above the fray of contentious psychoanalysis by a secret inner circle who helped manage the movement so as to protect Freud's image. Freud made special rings for the members of this group. After Nuremberg, to be a psychoanalyst meant to be a loyal Freudian. After his term of office as president of the IPA ended in 1912, Jung broke with Freud in a series of lectures at Fordham University. The location was significant. Recognizing the United States as the country most open to psychoanalysis, Jung continually praised Freud as the beginner of psychoanalysis, but rebuked him for his claim that libido was necessarily always sexual. Jung kept the term, but broadened it to an energetic principle of motivation that sought outlet in behavior and thought, whether healthy or unhealthy. Jung also disagreed with Freud's pessimistic view of human nature and his dismissal of religion. Jung thought religious urges were deep, inerasable, and of great value. Because he did not need Freud, a break was inevitable and it was bitter. The correspondence between Freud and Jung ends with each throwing psychoanalytic diagnoses at each other. Jung established his own system called simply analytic psychology, which eventually developed into something of a religious cult. I'm not surprised Carl Jung went to America and got poppin', because essentially what he's saying is like, not everything is about sex, and religion is kind of cool. And that's what Americans like to hear, or at least Americans at that time. Americans are very wary about sex. We're very weird about sex. I know people tend to think we are a very hypersexual people. That's not true, I would say. For a long time, we were a very prudish nation. So here comes this, weird German guy. He shows up and says that, psychology is not all about sex. And this guy, Freud, he's tripping. And by the way, religion is pretty based. I'm not surprised he got popping in the States, but I'm going to continue. Anyway, the focus of the IPA shifted to Berlin under the leadership of Freud loyalist Karl Abraham, born 1877 and died in 1925. Abraham made psychoanalysis into a profession rather than a science, establishing a standard training regime for psychoanalysis, including the requirement that candidates for psychoanalysis had to undergo an analysis themselves. The Berlin model became the standard for psychoanalytic training everywhere. Now, is Freud's psychoanalysis a science? In this chapter, we have examined the development of Freud's ideas about the mind, both normal and abnormal. Freud, of course, founded a movement, revolutionary, he hoped, not just another theory of mind and behavior. In Chapter 8, we saw that scientific psychology, although born in Germany, soon became an American science. The same was true about psychoanalysis. From early on, psychoanalysis flourished more in America than in Germany, as Freud's most important followers, C.G. Jung, recognized. Examining the transfer of psychoanalysis from being a German to being an American discipline will shed more light on the similar transformation of scientific psychology. In this final section on Freud's version of psychoanalysis, we will ask the important and much debated question, was Freud's theory scientific? Is psychoanalysis a science or a pseudoscience? The claim of psychoanalysis to be a science like any other has always been controversial. Positivists found Freudian hypotheses vague and difficult to test. The most influential attack on the scientific status of psychoanalysis was mounted by Karl Popper, who regarded psychoanalysis as a pseudoscience. As we learned in Chapter 1, Popper formulated the falsifiability principle as the demarcation criterion separating genuine scientific viewpoints from those that are merely pretended to be scientific. According to the falsifiability principle, to be worthy of a science, a theory must make predictions that can be proven unequivocally wrong. Popper, however, found that psychoanalysts were always able to explain any behavior, no matter how apparently inconsistent with psychoanalysis. Somewhere in the complex topography, structures, and dynamics of the mind could be found an explanation for anything at all, from a woman's fiddling with her purse, symbolic of masturbation, to the space race, phallic competition to build the biggest missile. In this Popperian spirit, the late philosopher Sidney Hook, over a span of a decade, asked numerous psychoanalysts to describe what a person without an Oedipus complex would be like. He never received a satisfactory reply. Indeed, in more than one instance, he was regarded with hostility and his question met with screaming. I want to laugh. Okay. Is psychoanalysis a failed science? Freud offered the therapeutic success of psychoanalysis as incontrovertible proof of psychoanalysis as a true theory of the mind. Freud said that psychoanalysis and only psychoanalysis could provide real cures for neuroses, because only psychoanalysis found the inner wishes and thoughts that tallied with the symptoms. Other therapies, Freud argued, could achieve only partial and temporary success because they did not go to the causes of neuroses, affecting by suggestion alone what little relief they provided. Philosopher Adolf Grunbaum, born Adolf Grunbaum, believes Freud's tally argument is falsifiable. If psychoanalysis is a science, the question becomes more of determining whether its claims are true or false. To be accepted as true on its own grounds, psychoanalysis must demonstrate unique therapeutic success. Unique success is vital to the tally argument, for if other therapeutic systems work at least as well as psychoanalysis, there is no reason to prefer the complexities of psychoanalysis to simpler theories. Behavior therapy, for example, rests on the simple principles of conditioning, and should it prove to be the equal of psychoanalysis, then, by Occam's razor, it is scientifically preferable to psychoanalysis. When we look into the therapeutic success of psychoanalysis, we find that although Freud boasted of success after success, he provided remarkably little data to support his claim. Freud reported only 6 cases in detail, one of which he did not treat and only 2 of which he claimed to be successes. The two allegedly successful cases were those of the Rat Man and the Wolf Man. The Rat Man was so called because of his morbid fears and fantasies about rats, and the Wolf Man was named for repeatedly dreaming about seeing wolves perched in a tree. Freud's descriptions of both cases failed to stand up to scrutiny. Numerous distortions of the truth mark both reports, and neither patient seems to have been cured. After claiming success with the Rat Man in print, Freud confessed to Jung that the Rat Man was far from cured, and like Dora, the Rat Man broke off therapy. The case of the Wolf Man is better known because he outlived Freud by many years, and near the end of his life told his story to a journalist. He stayed in analysis for free years after Freud's death. He told the reporter that he wrote a memoir about his case at the behest of one of his later analysts to show the world how Freud cured a seriously ill person. But it's all false. He felt just as ill when he went to Freud. In fact, he said the whole thing looks like a catastrophe. Fisher and Greenberg wrote a largely sympathetic review of the status of psychoanalysis as science, but concluded that Freud's own cases were largely unsuccessful. Later, therapy outcome studies would provide no evidence to suggest that psychoanalysis is a uniquely effective therapy. Gains from all forms of therapy are modest, and most forms of therapy have about equal success. Although Freud thought little of experimental attempts to verify psychoanalysis, many psychologists and analysts have carried out experiments with highly variable results. Psychoanalysis seems to be caught on the horns of a dilemma. Either psychoanalysis cannot be tested, in which case it is a pseudoscience, or it can be tested, in which case it is at best a very poor science. Yeah, it's not science. It's not real. Okay, that was the end. What was the point of chapter 9? I know Freud is so important that you have to talk about Freud when telling the history of psychology, but my God, when you actually read his whole fucking... The man was Dr. Umar. Freud was essentially the white Dr. Umar. That's what it is. The white Dr. Umar is Sigmund Freud. Go into the comments. Kamal says, Comrade, what was that complex type you just mentioned? I recall it being referenced in Baby Boy. Do you mean the Oedipus complex? The Oedipus complex when you want to fuck your mama and kill your daddy? That one? Guy proves you need not have an STD to be a sick fuck, says Kamal. Absolutely true, man. Facts. Facts. It's funny as hell. It's funny as hell that Kamal is referencing Baby Boy. I keep forgetting if Kamal is from America or if he's from the UK. Either one. Y'all are funny, man. Facts. But anyway, I think it's called the Oedipus complex. That one. Okay. Anyway, we finished chapter 8. Chapter 9. Sorry, it's late. We finished chapter 9. We're going to read chapter 10 tomorrow. But we have one more section we have to read. It's the Party of Suspicion. This is the last section we'll read, then we'll call it a day. With the advent of modernization came new modes of production that would increase wealth prodigiously. Unsurprisingly, then, modernism had a destructive aspect. However, the destructive forces of modernism were not aimed at the old pre-modern order, but at the makers of modernity, the bourgeoisie. Marx had despised the bourgeoisie, and so did Freud. United in opposition to the ruling class's ideas, Freud, together with Marx and Nietzsche, formed part of what Jacques Lacan, a hermeneutical psychoanalysis, called the Party of Suspicion. The party's impact on 20th century thought has been immense. The common enemy of the Party of Suspicion was the middle class. Breuer said that Freud's emphasis on sex was motivated in part by a desire to départir, shock, les bourgeoisie. Marx worked for the proletarian revolution that would destroy capitalism and the bourgeoisie. I think it's helpful to note that Marx didn't look at the bourgeoisie as the middle class. The bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production. And there's a petite bourgeoisie that you could argue is the professional managerial class, I guess, the higher paid workers in the capitalist system of exploitation. But yeah, the bourgeoisie is not the middle class. I would not say that, anyway, I digress. Anyway. And Nietzsche denounced middle-class morals as unfit for the Übermensch, literally overman, a superman, Nietzsche's idealized man of the future. The common weapon of the Party of Suspicion was unmasking. Freud revealed depths of incestuous sexual depravity behind the seemingly innocent screen of middle-class respectability. Marx revealed self-centered greed and the aspirations of entrepreneurial capitalists. And Nietzsche revealed craving cowards behind Christian martyrs. Go into the comments. Kamal says, America, smiley face. Okay, yeah, Kamal's from America. I keep forgetting. My bad. We got a good old American boy up in here. Good old American. USA. 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 Anyway, finishing. To the Party of Suspicion. Nothing is as it seems to be. In Freudian psychology, this means that no utterance, no action is what it seems to be. Everything requires interpretation. As Alasdair MacIntyre observes, the social sciences, especially psychology, are unique among the sciences because their theories might influence the subjects about which they write. As a result, psychology shapes the reality it describes, and the over-interpretive mode of life, as MacIntyre calls it, plays an important role in modern life. Freud made available the thought of the unacknowledged motive as an all-pervasive presence, so that each of us is encouraged to try and look behind the overt simplicities of the behavior of others to what is actually moving them, and equally encouraged to respond to that hidden reality rather than the surface appearance of the other. Working within the over-interpretive mode of life, nothing can be believed. Every statement, every action requires as interpretive gloss. The interpretations no longer need to be traditionally Freudian. To see the effects of overinterpretation, one need only consider the oddity of modern television news, in which reporters, quoting experts and anonymous insiders, tell us, the people, how a presidential speech will play to the people. No longer do government officials say things, they send messages to be decoded by pundits. Authority and sincerity have been dissolved. What Freud and the Party of Suspicion have bequeathed you is paranoia. Well, that's deep and depressing and worth flexing, worth reflection. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up here. We're going to come back to chapter 10 tomorrow, okay? Chapter 10, let's see how many pages is chapter 10. Woo! Chapter 10 is quite a doozy. Chapter 10 goes from 283 to 325. Can we do it, boys? Can we do it, boys? Should we do it, boys? Damn. We might split that in half. There's no way. There's no way. Yeah. Chapter 10 will have to be split in half. Because there's no way. There's absolutely no way. Yeah, chapter 10 is going to get split in half. We might read like 40 pages tomorrow. Something like that. 283. Yeah, I'll do the math on that later. But anyway, we're going to stop right here. Hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. Y'all be easy out there. Get some rest. Hope you had a good weekend. And peace.